Hello, welcome to the Hollywood Video Podcast. So, in the last video I did, I talked about, well, more like I briefly mentioned, Steve Jobs and how he's had enough involvement in movies that he could be appropriate subject matter for this podcast. Like I mentioned before, I'd heard of his passing in the most innocuous of ways. I was at my job working at a Chinese buffet. I believe it was back in 2011. Let's see. Yeah, 2011. I'm just pushing a cart with dishes and leftover stuff, looking around, nothing out of the ordinary. And then I looked up at the TV in the bar, and I find out, oh, Steve Jobs passed away. And I probably really wouldn't have known who he was if I hadn't done research on Pixar. And also a friend of mine, he was big into them. Like, he was a fan. So I'm like, oh, wow, he's gone. And it's interesting. I've read his biography about 4 or 5 times. I suppose it's kind of like a bridge from sort of the analog days of old up until the current digital age we're in, which I'm just older, young enough to remember. Like, I can remember a time. I remember a time before the internet. So, what a lot of people don't know is that he was involved in movies. Well, more specifically with Pixar. Also, as soon as he died, it seemed like a lot of Steve Jobs movies got put into the pipeline. And even before then, like when he came back to Apple, a movie came out. And even on, like, I think it's either College Humor or Funny or Die, he got a quote-unquote movie, which I think more made fun of the contrivances of biopics. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're kind of not going to go in like the proper order. It's just going to be based on what I feel like. So, the first one we're going to talk about is what's the name? Oh, yes. Ashton Kutcher's portrayal of Steve Jobs. So this movie came out in, I want to say 2013. I'm going to the popular culture. Wow, there were... Okay. So, the first movie we're going to talk about is Jobs, which had Ashton Kutcher portray Steve Jobs. Now, I went into this movie back in the day fairly optimistic. And even afterwards, I'm like, okay, it wasn't a bad movie. This is kind of the typical cradle to the grave biopic. It tries to condense a lot into a 2-hour time frame And I don't know. First off, I want to say what I think is positive about it. Ashton Kutcher, of well, with I don't know. I think he is perhaps the most Steve. He looks the most like Steve Jobs of any of the actors that have portrayed it. I would say him and Noah Weil are about tied. And you could, throughout the whole movie, you kind of tell that he is really trying to separate himself from being Kelso from that 70s show. There's no trace of that character in this performance at all. And you can tell that he did his homework. You can tell that he watched probably hours of Steve Jobs, paid excessive amount of attention. That he observed like, oh, Steve does this, he does that, he has this inflection in his voice. He really went method and did detailed research. So he is not the weak link in this movie. Having read the Steve Jobs biography, with full disclosure, a lot of Steve's friends and family don't like. I just felt like it was missing a lot. I think my biggest complaint with it is it feels like a Hallmark card. Not even a Hallmark movie, but I don't know. That's like the best I can come up with. Like maybe it's that it portrays him as this almost kind of messiah or whatever, which you could argue even the book does that. But the book also portrays his dark side, the stuff that he was supposedly known for. And there are moments. One of the things about all these movies is there are moments of him just being absolutely vitriolic. That's kind of the common denominator of all these films. And when I kind of can't help but feel like you go into a movie about Steve Jobs' life and you expect shouting, denigrating, belittling of somebody who just doesn't get the vision. And I don't know, I think that's one of the things that struck me about the book and reading about him. It's like, oh, you can be that honest with someone. You can express your opinion that much. And who knows, like, there's definitely stuff like that. But I guess it's one of those things where who knows if my opinion would be different if I hadn't read his biography or any biography, because there is one biography which I forget about that apparently Steve's close circle, they like it better than the Walter Isaacson book. But I don't know, like, if somebody puts on Jobs with Ashton Kutcher, I could probably tolerate it, watch, and like, okay, that's fine. But it's not something that I like anticipate seeing. I want to watch that again. Um, One interesting thing is, I don't think any of these movies delve into his childhood. Like, they don't show any scenes from him being a kid, which is interesting because him being adopted is like such a key aspect of his character. Does show his trip to India and presumably him tripping on acid, which he has said is like a core memory for him and helped him to think different. I guess the biggest criticism of this movie would be there are so many sagas in the life of Steve Jobs that it doesn't give enough attention. Like, if you know about Steve Jobs, you're like, oh man, they skipped over that. One thing that's surprising is these movies all seem to skip over his time in Pixar, which that's for probably more of a licensing thing with Disney and Pixar than it is like a story problem, which, what can be done about that? So Ashton Kutcher does great, and none of these movies really. Okay, I'll move on and talk more about the commonality between them later. Um, the second movie I want to talk about is I, Steve, which this is more of a parody film, but okay, so I can confirm it was done by Funny or Die. So I would say that this is the better movie than Jobs. Funny thing about it, though, is you can tell that they didn't have a lot of money. Now, it's wildly inaccurate, even more so than Jobs, but it is more entertaining. Apparently, the movie was written in 3 days and shot in 5 days, which is just hysterical that I don't know if this movie had any kind of budget. I think it was just famous people who just had time to kill, and they're like, oh, what the heck? So I don't think it had any budget of any kind, whereas Jobs had a budget of 12 million. All right, according to the stats, Jobs was a financial success because it had a budget of 12 million, had a box office of 42 million, so it made its money back. And I, Steve was just a internet film, so it's apples and oranges. I remember liking I, Steve more. It had Justin Long as Steve Jobs, and it leans into I guess because it's more of a caricature of like, okay, we're obviously making fun of all the stuff he's known for, than saying like, okay, this is how he is. There's kind of a wink at the camera that we can all kind of indulge. Let's see. Oh, and they got the guy who played Hurley from Lost to play Steve Wozniak. That was the thing I perhaps remember most about this movie is their meeting in the movie between the two Steves, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. It seems like such a movie thing of like two guys meeting. I've only ever seen it once, and it was back in the day. I feel like this movie was released in conjunction with the release of Jobs. The next movie on our list, Steve Jobs, directed by Danny Boyle and written by Aaron Sorkin. It has Michael Fassbender as Steve Jobs, which he doesn't look a lot like him, but definitely he brings the rage. I mean, he played Magneto, so this is the one that I more recently enjoyed. I remember hearing about this. Like, this is 2 years after Jobs came out and I-Steve came out, which I really only think they've released I-Steve as kind of like riding on the marketing of Jobs. Steve Jobs, I remember hearing, okay, they're having a second go at making a movie about Steve Jobs. And I remember one of the things that caught my attention was it had Aaron Sorkin as the writer, and they actually got the rights to the Walter Isaacson novel about Steve Jobs, which that intrigued me. Apparently, Walter Isaacson, even though the biography he wrote wasn't liked by any of Steve's close circle, Steve Jobs chose him specifically to write it. So, and then there were a lot of people who were being thrown about for director. Finally, they chose Danny Boyle, and I'm like, okay, that's a caliber of talent I can respect. He did Slumdog Millionaire, amongst other things. And I'm like, oh wow, let's see how this goes. And one of the things I was most, I think, let's see, David Fincher was at one point discussed to be involved. I'm like, that is intriguing. Not the least because him and Aaron Sorkin worked on the Social Network together. So I'm like, oh wow, how are they going to tackle this? And I think at some point, Christian Bale was in talks to play Steve Jobs. And so I was like, okay, I am sold on this. Because at that time, he was at the age where, with the right kind of makeup, he could play different stages of Steve Jobs' life. So I could buy it. And just, he was still doing that whole body transformation thing where he would gain and lose weight like insane in such like short time periods. He since said like, I can't do that. I'm getting too old, which, you know, that's fair. But he wound up not doing it, and the role instead went to Michael Fassbender. So he does an amazing job all throughout. The one criticism of Michael Fassbender is there are parts of the movie where he's supposed to be in his 20s, and it's like not fooling anybody. I mean, he doesn't look elderly, but it's just like, it's one of those things where you're like, okay, it's kind of like, you know, in Greece, you have all these people in their 30s supposed to be teenagers, but you're just like, okay, you don't read too much into it. Now, one of the most interesting things, this could be the most interesting of all these movies, just because they use aesthetics to complement the film. And what I mean by that is they use different film formats for each era of Steve Jobs' life. For the era where he's at Apple and he's like trying to push the Lisa, they shoot the film on 16 millimeter film. And in the next era of his life, where I believe, let's see. Oh, let's see, I stand corrected. It wasn't the Lisa computer, it was the Macintosh. And, yeah. So anyway, during the 1984 era, the film is shot on 16 millimeter film to sort of represent that era. And then at the next launch for his computer, the film is shot in 35 millimeter. And at the 1998 iMac reveal, the movie is shot digitally. Let's say we've arrived in the internet digital age. That was an interesting choice. And I would say this movie is far more interesting than Jaws. It's basically just a movie that is all talking. And it's also surprisingly visual. And usually movies like that, they don't work. It's just one, you veer into a movie that's visual and talking. Either the visuals are strong and the dialogue is weak, but in this case, they're very complementary of one another. If I were to criticize the movie for anything, I've already mentioned Michael Fassbender not appearing to be funny when his character is supposed to be funny. And they did this in Jobs as well. There are a lot of quotes from Steve Jobs about, simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. And there's moments in this movie as well where they try to find a natural way to interject, these famous Steve Jobs quotes into the film. And so it's like, I mean, if you didn't know, if you weren't familiar, they'd probably go over your head. But if you do, it's just like, okay, that feels a bit hackneyed. But again, it feels more like a nitpick than anything. I think for me, the movie, for me, kind of begins to lose momentum when it enters the third act, when Steve is revealing the iMac. And I think where it loses me is it starts to really slow down when Steve is confronting all the sort of ghosts of his past. When he confronts John Scully, when he confronts his daughter, and when he confronts Steve Wozniak, who all throughout the movie is saying, like, acknowledge the Apple II team, which is like, it's one of those things where it's like, the Apple II was in the 80s, and so much time goes by. I mean, maybe that's just because I grew up in the 90s, and I think, the 80s and 90s, that's so far apart. When you think about it, it really isn't. Yeah, Seth Rogen's portrayal of Steve Wozniak is, I don't think I've ever seen a bad performance by Seth Rogen. Yes, even taking into account Green Hornet. But I almost feel like Seth Rogen's, like Steve Wozniak, his sole function in the movie is to interject at these presentations and say, acknowledge the Apple II team, Steve. But again, he doesn't do a bad job. It's just like, I don't think he's not used as effectively as it could be, which, that's a shame because Seth Rogen is a talented actor and comedian. I will say that there's really no portrayal of Lisa in Jobs, but in Steve Jobs, I suppose her function in the story is to kind of get under his skin and pull back the curtain on this guy. Because she gets this sort of humble admission from him at the climax. All throughout the movie, well, with few exceptions, we've been inside the building. But they go to the top of the building and she's grilling him on being absent, and he says, I'm poorly made. And it's an interesting admission for somebody who's always striving for perfection, that he can say this about himself. And the movie ends on an optimistic note. Him walking onto the stage, his daughter on the side looking at him, being his elements. So it was an enjoyable movie. I don't think it did great at the box office, unfortunately. It was made on a budget of 30 million, so had nearly 3 times the budget of Jobs, and it only pulled in 34 million, which is a shame because it was the better movie, I think. So I almost feel like I don't have to mention Ice-T, simply for the fact that, well, I will give it this. It's a comedy, it's a parody, it was thrown together. But it's surprising how good it is for a movie that is simply just thrown together. It's basically a bunch of buddies getting together and making a movie. And it's surprising what they're able to do in such a short amount of time. I would dare say, perhaps maybe the most efficient use of resources in this review. But again, there isn't much to go on. It's really an apple and oranges thing. Justin Long does pretty good as Steve Jobs. And again, it's a parody. It really makes fun of sort of cradle to grave biopics. So it's effective in that. And I just feel it's worth mentioning. Some people really detect it, but, oh well. So this is going to be a short review. I think I'm really actually finished. Uh, let's see. I guess the last one to review, and then we're going to talk about the involvement with Pixar, because it's important. Let's see. Pirates of Silicon Valley. Pirates of Silicon Valley. This was made maybe just a year or two. It's interesting. The other two movies were made very close to Steve Jobs' death, but this one was made right as he was coming back to Apple. So all this stuff had happened in real life, and they were already making a movie about it. I feel like movies like this got to be made. They used to be made way more frequently, not so much. So it's funny, I haven't seen this movie since it came out, but I just thought it's worth mentioning. So one of the things that Steve did was, for the release of the Macintosh, he created this famous ad of that referenced the novel, the dystopian novel 1984, where computers were going to be used to control people. And there's this image of these hapless slaves being sat in front of a TV and this big booming voice giving this very fascist sounding speech. And then this woman runs up with a hammer. She's being chased by police, and she throws the hammer at the screen. And then the caption reads, "Why 1984 won't be like 1984. The movie starts off with Jobs overseeing this advertisement being shot. And then it goes to the 1997 Macworld Expo when he's come back. And then it kind of just goes throughout. The whole movie then goes to, what I remember of it is Steve Jobs and Bill Gates, they're working together on Apple, like, because one of the ways they became friends, or I don't know, they seem to have more of a frenemy relationship. It's complex, let's just say that. One of the ways they like became aware of each other's existence is Apple was making computers, and then Windows or Microsoft, they wrote programs and software for them. I'm sure it's more detailed than that. And then Microsoft created its own OS, and Steve was like, you guys just ripped us off and copied Macintosh. And it was a point of contention for them for the longest time. So that's kind of the big drama. And it basically covers, it deals with him not wanting to admit that his daughter, Lisa, is his daughter. I don't think she gets really she doesn't get as much acknowledgement as in some of the other movies. And similar to Jobs, it ends at the 1997 Expo, where Bill Gates famously appears on a big screen, and Steve is like, yeah, we're going to work together with them. They're going to help us out. And the crowd is split. Yeah. So this movie was the first sort of media portrayal of Steve Jobs and Bill Gates. A guy named Noah Weil played Steve Jobs, and Anthony Michael Hall played Bill Gates. So the funny thing about Noah Weil is in 1999, Steve Jobs was having an event, and he brought Noah Weil on to portray him and lead the speech for a bit. And then, of course, he steps out and everybody has a good laugh. So I kind of remember him as like sort of the best depiction of Steve Jobs. Maybe because that was the first portrayal I had of him, and that was my base reference until I saw other films. So I would say it's kind of neck and neck with Steve Jobs, the 2015 movie. And this one was all the way in 1999. So one of the things that none of these movies deal with is Steve Jobs ran Pixar for a while. Like when it was a struggling part of Lucasfilm and George Lucas is going through a messy divorce, Steve came in and he bought it. At first, he was just interested in the tech aspect, but then he realized, oh, these guys are creative. And one of the things that is noticeable about his ownership of Pixar is he was surprisingly hands-off with this. He wasn't at first he was a bit, but then he cooled off and let Pixar do their thing. John Lasseter would come in and say, can I have money for a short? And Steve would write the check and say, just make sure it's entertaining, which they did. And when Pixar started their alliance with Disney, their partnership, not Dwight, just alliance, Steve was just as crafty a negotiator as Jeffrey Katzenberg, and it's very possible that if they didn't have him to stand up to Jeffrey Katzenberg, we would never know Pixar as we know them. Because Katzenberg is a sly figure who, I don't know, there's no doubt we'll probably do an episode on him as well. But anyway, yeah, surprisingly, Steve Jobs didn't try to control Pixar as much as he did any of his other endeavors. And one of the things I'd found out that was really sweet was towards the end of his life, Steve had a copy of Toy Story 3 that he watched, which I thought, oh, that's nice. It's very interesting that none of the movies show, they don't go into that part of his career, his involvement with Pixar. But again, probably more not wanting to deal with Disney and everything than anything else. Although they can mention Apple and they don't have to do anything. So it's worth mentioning that basically all of Steve's close circle, his wife, Tim Cook, Johnny Ives, etc., none of them alike the media portrayals of Steve Jobs. Johnny Ives said it the most. He said, the thing that they miss is the sort of childlike playfulness and enthusiasm, which I think is where the supposed anger and vitriol stems from. Like when he is so enthusiastic about the ideas and the innovations that when people don't see the big picture, that's where the anger comes from. It's like, why can't you see what I see? Like, are we looking at the same thing? Like, that's where it comes from. And he says, that's what's missing from it. He said, there's nothing of the person that I knew of in Steve Jobs in these portrayals. And then he's like, I'm sorry to disappoint anyone. So, yeah, I'm sure that there are going to be more Steve Jobs movies in the future or projects. Just one of those characters that begs for that. I will say, it is interesting that Apple, having gotten into the streaming wars, they have Apple TV. It is interesting that they haven't made a project themselves about Steve Jobs. It would seem like a match made in heaven. I mean, he's their guy, but maybe they figure it'll be far too indulgent. And I'm really surprised that they don't make like a TV show about it. Like, I could see Apple has had a bunch of projects on their streaming platform. I'm like, oh man, that's so cool, but I don't want to sign up for another streaming platform. But basically stepping back into the trap of cable. But if they did, that might be the thing that makes me say, all right, Tim Cook, take my money. And the structure is set up perfectly. They could totally do like a limited 4-season thing, like his childhood, him starting up Apple, him being gone, starting up Next and Pixar, and then his glorious return and eventual death. Like, that could get eyeballs, I think. But who knows if Tim Cook, if that's on his radar. And I don't know how involved he is with making the shows there. I'm sure it's something he gives off to other people. I will say, for Steve being such a control freak, and this has nothing to do with the movies, but it could be a movie moment. Steve Jobs and Tim Cook are two totally different people. Steve is the visionary who's like, this idea would be so cool. Tim Cook, notably, he's more of the logistics guy of how to make the vision happen. What's the actual physical steps we need to take to get things done? And some people have argued, yeah, Steve Jobs brought the vision, but Tim Cook made it possible. And some people have even said Apple would not be as successful today under Steve Jobs as it has been under Tim Cook. And I think that's fair. And I think, in a way, perhaps maybe Steve knew that. Maybe Steve made Apple walk so Tim Cook could help it run. I think that makes sense, and I think that's a fair assessment. And to Steve Jobs' credit, one of the last things he said, allegedly, to Tim Cook before Tim took over and before Steve died was, he said to him, "You don't have to do things like I did." And I'm sure that must have freed Tim up. Like, that must have been a thing that he was worried about. Even though he had had stints where he did take over while Steve was in surgery or recovering. Yeah, so he was a real person, but also at the same time, he was a mythological figure in hindsight. And that's the interesting thing when people are both mythological and real at the same time. And you got to wonder which comes first. Well, this has been the Hollywood Video Podcast. Have an absolutely super day. Go watch a movie, and I hope all your dreams come true. Bye.